The most hated classic car of the 1960s finally gets its true story told, and honestly fans are completely divided on this one. Some people say it was a dangerous death trap that deserved everything it got. Others say it was one of the most unfairly destroyed cars in American automotive history. And here's the thing, both sides have a point, and neither side is completely right, and that is exactly why this story still gets people fired up today. So we're going inside the real story of the Chevrolet Corvair, because nobody is telling this the way it actually happened. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling me which side you're on. Did the Corvair deserve its reputation, or was it set up to fail? I genuinely want to know, because Corvair people are serious about this and the debate never really died. So let me set the scene for you properly. It's 1959. General Motors is the most powerful car company on earth. They're selling massive, chrome-covered, V8, powered American machines, and they're winning. Every year. And then somebody inside GM, a group of engineers led by a man named Ed Cole, who was one of the most talented automotive minds the company ever had, pitches an idea that sounds almost insane for an American manufacturer at that time. They want to build a compact rear-engine car with an air-cooled flat-six engine mounted in the back, independent suspension at all four corners, and a body that looks nothing like anything GM had made before. Cole had been pushing for this project for years and finally got the green light. They called it the Corvair. Now you have to understand what that actually meant in the context of 1959 America. The cars on American roads at that time were enormous. Big V8 engines, soft suspension, heavy steel everywhere, front engine rear-wheel drive, and they handled like you were steering a sofa down a highway. Nobody expected GM to come out with something that felt genuinely European, something that had more in common with what Volkswagen and Porsche were doing than what Ford and Chrysler were doing. The Corvair had its engine in the back, same as the Volkswagen Beetle, but it was way more sophisticated than the Beetle. The suspension design was genuinely advanced. The styling was clean and modern and low. GM engineers were not just proud of this car, some of them called it the best thing the company had ever built from an engineering standpoint. And the public responded. When the Corvair launched for the 1960 model year, it genuinely sold well. People bought it because it was different, because it was lighter, because it felt alive when you turned into a corner in a way that most American cars just didn't. You could feel the road through it. GM actually offered multiple body styles, sedans, coupes, convertibles, even a van called the Greenbrier, and a pickup called the Rampside. They were betting big on this platform. And for a while it looked like GM had actually done something genuinely bold and gotten away with it. Then the 1962 model year arrived and GM introduced something called the Corvair Monza Spider. Turbocharged. This is where it gets interesting and where most people skip over the full picture. The Spider had a turbocharged version of the flat-six producing around 150 horsepower, which was strong for a compact car in 1962. It had bucket seats and a 4-speed manual, and it was genuinely fast and involving to drive. Car enthusiasts loved it. It had a real cult following, and not the nostalgic kind, actual enthusiasts at the time who drove it on roads and compared it favorably to imported sports cars. This wasn't a car being defended after the fact. It was being celebrated in real time. Then everything fell apart. And the way it fell apart is honestly one of the strangest chapters in American car history. In 1965, a lawyer named Ralph Nader published a book. The book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. And the first chapter, the entire first chapter, was dedicated to destroying the Corvair. Nader argued the car was inherently dangerous, that its rear-engine layout combined with its swing-axle rear suspension made it unstable, prone to oversteer, and capable of sudden and unpredictable handling failures that could kill a driver who didn't know what was coming. He wrote it with the urgency of someone sounding a public health alarm, and America heard it loud and clear. Now here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, and honestly this is the part one find fascinating because it's not clean, it's not simple, and neither side tells it completely straight. Because Nader wasn't entirely fabricating things. There were documented accidents involving the early Corvairs. The 1960 through 1963 models did have handling characteristics that required attention from the driver. The swing-axle rear suspension could produce oversteer, meaning the rear end could step out, particularly in aggressive cornering, and particularly if the tire pressures weren't properly maintained. Here's the detail that makes it worse. GM actually recommended running the front tires at significantly lower pressure than the rear, which was counterintuitive and which many owners simply didn't follow because it went against everything they'd ever been told about tire inflation. In those conditions, with wrong pressures and an inexperienced driver who didn't know how to manage oversteer, the early Corvair could behave in ways that surprised people badly. That part is documented and real. But here is what Nader's book either didn't know or chose not to say loudly enough. By the time Unsafe at Any Speed hit bookstores in 1965, GM had already redesigned the car. The 1964 model got improved rear suspension that addressed the worst of the handling concerns. And the 1965 Corvair, which rolled out the same year as the book and was sitting in showrooms while people were reading Nader's warnings, had a completely new fully independent rear suspension, not a revised version of the old system, a fundamentally different design. Handling specialists who tested the 1965 model were saying publicly that it was among the most capable cars in America from a dynamics standpoint. Nader was writing about a car that in its criticized form no longer existed. The 1965 Corvair, and I genuinely cannot say this strongly enough, was a completely different machine from the car he described. Road and Track put it on their test track. Car and Driver drove it and compared its handling characteristics to the Porsche 911. Not loosely, not as marketing puffery, as a specific technical comparison between two rear-engine cars with independent suspension. The 1965 Corvair Corsa in its top turbocharged configuration made 180 horsepower, handled with precision that American cars almost never delivered, and looked absolutely beautiful in the fastback coupe body that GM's designers had come up with for the second generation. If you'd told someone in Europe this was an American car, they might not have believed you. And none of that mattered even slightly. Because the book had already landed. Congress was already scheduling hearings. And then GM did something that turned an industry controversy into a full national scandal. Instead of defending the car, instead of holding press events to demonstrate what the 1965 suspension could do, instead of putting journalists in the new car and letting them compare it to the vehicle Nader described, GM hired private investigators to dig up personal dirt on Ralph Nader. They were trying to find something, anything, that could be used to discredit him personally. They reportedly investigated his personal life, his background, his associates. When this became public, and it did become public, it was the kind of revelation that makes everyone forget what the original argument was about. Now it wasn't about the car. Now it was about a giant corporation trying to silence a private citizen who had criticized them. GM's president James Roche had to appear before a Senate subcommittee and publicly apologize to Nader. Publicly. In front of Congress. The optics were catastrophic. Suddenly GM looked like the villain in a story about public safety. Suddenly the Corvair was the smoking gun that proved American automakers were reckless with people's lives and would rather bury the problem than fix it. It didn't matter that they had already fixed it. The story had a shape now, and the shape was Villain Company Hyde's dangerous car. The Corvair never recovered from that moment, even though the actual car on the lots in 1965 and 1966 and 1967 deserved none of what was happening to its reputation. Sales collapsed hard. Year over year the numbers dropped and kept dropping. GM didn't fight it. They didn't launch campaigns defending the redesign, didn't do aggressive testing demonstrations, didn't push back meaningfully in the press. They quietly wound down production, and in 1969 the last Corvair rolled off the assembly line with no ceremony, no announcement, no acknowledgement of what the car had been or what it had become. Just gone. Killed by a reputation it had spent its last several years genuinely not deserving. Now here is where the fan community enters this story and why the division you see today is real and not just internet noise. There is a serious, documented, deeply passionate community of Corvair enthusiasts that has existed continuously since the car was killed. The Corvair Society of America was founded in 1969, the exact same year GM discontinued the car, as if the people who loved it knew history was about to bury something it shouldn't. The organization has tens of thousands of active members. These aren't people who just like the look of an old car. These are people who restore them mechanically, who drive them on autocross courses, who have read every piece of documentation about the engineering and the controversy and the aftermath, and who will explain to you in detailed technical terms why the car's reputation was built on a foundation that had collapsed before the ink was dry on Nader's book. Their strongest piece of evidence is something that almost nobody talks about. In 1972, 7 years after Unsafe at Any Speed came out, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration commissioned an independent engineering study specifically to evaluate the Corvair's handling compared to other vehicles of the same era. This was not a study commissioned by GM. This was a federal government study. And the findings came back clearly. The study found that the handling of the 1960 through 1963 Corvair did not represent an unreasonable risk when compared to other contemporary vehicles. It was not a uniquely dangerous car. It was a car with handling characteristics that required driver awareness, which described most cars of that period. And the 1965 and later Corvair with the redesigned suspension was found to be equal or superior to most other vehicles in its class. That study was published. It received almost no public attention because the story was already settled in the public mind. Nobody wanted to reopen it. But I want to be fair here because this is where the genuine division in the enthusiast community comes from, and it's not as simple as Nader bad, Corvair good. There are serious Corvair fans who will tell you that the early cars did have real issues, that Nader identified something the automotive press had been too friendly to acknowledge, and that the real crime wasn't the criticism, it was GM's decision to let the car die quietly rather than defend what it had actually become. These people love the Corvair and still think GM failed it by refusing to fight for it. That's a completely defensible position. GM had the evidence. They had the redesigned car sitting in showrooms. They had test results. And they chose corporate survival over the car's survival. That's not Nader's fault. What makes the whole story almost surreal when you sit with it is the Porsche angle. Because the engineering philosophy that Nader argued made the Corvair dangerous, rear engine, swing axle rear suspension on the early cars, the tendency toward oversteer, is essentially the same engineering that defined the Porsche 911, which launched in 1963. Porsche refined and developed that rear-engine oversteer tendency into something that enthusiasts called feel and feedback and connection. Porsche built a 50-year legacy on it. The 911 became maybe the most celebrated sports car in history. The same layout, the same fundamental characteristic, different country, different story, different outcome. In America it became a scandal. In Germany it became a legend. That gap is hard to look at directly without feeling like something deeply unfair happened. If you're at a car show or an auction today and you see a clean 1965 or 1966 Corvair Corsa convertible or that fastback coupe in a good color, you are looking at something that serious collectors are actively pursuing right now. The window on finding unmolested examples at reasonable prices has been closing for years. The ones that have been properly restored, especially the turbocharged Corsa models, are getting attention they never got when they were new. History is slowly doing what GM never bothered to do, which is making the case that the car was worth something. If I'm being honest with you, and I try to be, if I had the chance to go back and be a car buyer in 1966 knowing what we know now, I'm buying the Corvair Corsa turbocharged without a second thought. Because you'd be getting a car that handled unlike anything else with an American badge, that looked genuinely beautiful, that had an engine layout and a driving experience that was completely different from everything around it, and that almost nobody else was buying at that point because the reputation had already done its damage. That combination of quality and obscurity is exactly what collectors spend their whole lives trying to find before everyone else does. The Corvair's real story isn't a story about a dangerous car. It's a story about what happens when timing goes wrong, when a company panics instead of fights, when one narrative reaches the public faster than the truth, and when the car that actually existed got buried under the reputation of an earlier version of itself that GM had already quietly fixed. The fans are divided because the history is genuinely complicated. The early cars had real characteristics that warranted attention, the later cars were genuinely excellent by any measure, and the bridge between those two facts got destroyed before most people even knew it was there. That's the Corvair. And honestly, it still isn't getting the full credit it deserves.